Hello, everybody. Welcome to our next session. We're going to look at some of the long-term effects of COVID-19 and some of the issues that are going on around the sports world in terms of how to assess and evaluate what those risks might be. Appreciate having with us today. We have Ricky Vellante from the Professional Collegiate League, and we have Shannon Lancaster from Arizona State University. Ricky and Shannon, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Whoop. Can I hear you guys?
Yes.
Yep.
AV is connected
Okay.
here.
I don't seem to be getting sound here. Let's try and find out what's,
Test.
Testing audio. Okay, some AV challenges.
okay, so it sounds like you can hear me, so that's a good starting point. So we'll do the best we can and figure out why that's working that way. All right, let's see if this works better now. Okay, do we have you now?
Test.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, sorry for that struggle at the outset. So again, it sounds like everybody could hear me, so that's good news. So Ricky and Shannon, welcome to the show. We appreciate you being with us as we start looking at what some of these long-term effects are going to be. I know there's been a lot of discussion of the COVID issues and the COVID risks. I think we truly don't know where those are going to go, but I'm going to start with Shannon. As you look at it from your side on the medical perspective, working with the student athletes, a lot of the plans and the formulations that you created and put into place over the course of the summer after the initial challenge and quick turnaround to shut things down were based on what the long-term risks are. So why don't you share with us what you've seen and what you feel are some of those longer-term risks?
Yeah, I think a lot of the challenge is right now they're perceived long-term risks from a medical side. We've got some data that coronavirus can affect the heart muscle, cause damage to the heart called myocarditis. Typically, people recover from that. But what is left unknown is if people do have myocarditis, kind of what is the outcome 3 years down the road, 10 years down the road, 50 years down the road. Additionally, we're starting to see more and more that it's a multi-system inflammatory process that can often happen. And so what's the effect on the neurologic system, right? We know that sometimes affected individuals lose their sense of taste and smell for weeks or months. And what's the long-term effect of that? What's the long-term effect of the lungs? And it can be quite challenging because if you're talking about someone that makes a living off of running, losing some of their lung function could, potentially be devastating. So at this point, we actually don't know too much. We're learning more each day as more information is becoming available and as more people are pooling data to try to increase numbers. But at this point, from the medical side, it is still quite limited. What we know for sure is a long-term risk.
I think that's part of the challenge, right? When you look at the whole obligation as everybody has to look at how do we protect the student athletes or any athletes from the risks, right? We see people playing in a bubble. And the challenge is, if they don't contract COVID because they're in a bubble, that's okay. But, Ricky, as you look at the Professional Collegiate League, you're dealing with obviously different scale of budget than what the NFL, or yeah, NFL's not a bubble, but the NBA and the NHL in terms of what they were able to execute. So in the context of what you're creating, how do you deal with balancing, in a sense, the risks for the athletes the costs that are involved with all of the monitoring, and then the long-term health concerns.
Yeah, so I think I want to start by saying that while I'm very critical of some of the things that are going on in college sports, I'm not critical of the fact that sports are taking place during the pandemic. But for me, the critical difference between the NBA bubble and the NWSL bubble, WNBA bubble, you know, these different bubbles that have been successful, is that in each of those situations, the athletes had a bargaining unit representing them and representing their interests and had a meaningful voice in the process. And because of, you know, labor law in the United States, they had to approve the processes and the procedures that were put in place, because these are all related to mandatory bargaining subjects, you know, whether it's working conditions, time, location of work, all those sorts of things. So, but you don't have that in college sports. You know, there is no representative body for the athletes. The athletes don't have a meaningful participation in setting the rules. So there's an inherent trust that universities have your best interests, which I'm not saying they don't. You know, many people involved in college sports do have the best interests of the athletes, but I don't think that's an absolute across the board. Where the PCL differs is that we will, because our athletes will be employees as opposed to being student athletes, legally speaking, they will have that opportunity to have a voice in the process and to ensure that they are comfortable with the procedures that we're putting in place. And so, and then of course, they're also going to be compensated for the risk that they're taking on. I think that's the other big difference is, you know, players professionally speaking in the NBA and these other leagues that are currently participating, are currently, you know, playing through the pandemic. You know, you're compensated for the risk associated with playing. Whereas again, that's not taking place in college athletics. So that's where I think the PCL differs in terms of operations. And I feel like there was another part of your question that I've now forgotten in the midst of my answer, but so I'll leave it there for now.
And I think that brings up an important distinction, right? Because I think that that's one of the challenges you see in every level of sports. When it's youth sports and you're talking about the youth athletes, and the coaches are usually parents, and things like that. I think one of the challenges of what goes on is the fear, and it's a realistic fear, right, is unknown, because you know, Shannon and I were speaking earlier, talking about the sample size of some of the studies in terms of what the long-term impacts might be, or myocarditis, or anything else that might arise. We don't know what that's going to look like, whether some of the short-term things that don't seem to be significant are creating long-term harm 5, 10, 20 years down the road. So Shannon, as you looked at the data, we'll cover it for this panel. You talked about those studies where there really were very, very small sample sizes as compared to a typical medical study. And maybe you can talk about sort of that scale and why that's an important consideration.
Yeah, typically in medicine, you know, when we physicians like data, and physicians like research studies so that we can base decisions off those. And typically we are looking at studies that have tens of thousands of people in them. Sometimes they pool studies together, so we have hundreds of thousands of people in them. So we actually have, they're really well, you know, powered. There's a lot of people. And this first study that came out about myocarditis that really shocked the medical community was a study of 70 people in Germany. And it kind of just, everyone was blown away about the potential effects of coronavirus. And then that was followed up in the Big Ten. Ohio State University released a study that had 26 athletes. And so it's so much of a difference. And as we continue to pool data nationally, you know, we're going to get more numbers and really figure out better what these risks are. But until then, we need to be conservative and keep health and safety in the forefront.
Yeah, I think that that's really right. When you look at it, for me, that's one of the challenges because we're making these decisions blind right now. And we're trying to evaluate inklings of what we've seen might be a problem and trying to extrapolate that into the policies and things like that. You know, what I'm trying to think through, and I'm interested in everyone's perspective, is to look at where does that come about, Ricky, as you look at these policies based on the really true fragments of information that we have available. How do you cobble together something that makes sense to minimize the risks? Because nobody wants to expose these athletes to unreasonable amounts of long-term risk, but we don't really know where the risk comes from.
Yeah, I would say that, so far, my biggest takeaway is that sports in the pandemic, um, you're going to have a certain percentage of athletes that contract coronavirus if you don't do it in a closed environment or a bubble. Uh, Once you introduce the travel component, there's just too many moving pieces. And once with people being able to come and go from home to and from, like every time you leave your team's facility, just because you were fine yesterday doesn't mean you're going to be okay tomorrow. So instituting these bubbles, I mean, clearly has been done successfully now, first by the NWSL, and now by the NBA and the WNBA. So every model that we've looked at, doing for our inaugural season next year, would be in a closed environment. And so in terms of like operationally setting things up, that involves finding a facility in a state that's taking the CDC guidelines seriously, first and foremost, because not all facilities are. And then, finding a facility that's also in close proximity to hotels that are of a sufficient quality that people could stay in for several months at a time. So because even, Major League Baseball, we've seen it, the NFL, we've seen it, these leagues that have incredible amounts of money have been unable to safely travel their teams from one place to the next. And that's even doing like, private charters, private buses, upscale, top flight hotels, basically the best money can buy sort of situation. And even in those, you've had breakouts amongst numbers of teams. So again, for us, it begins and ends with, it has to be a closed environment, has to be at a place that the facility in the local area is taking it seriously. And we need to be doing everything in our power to keep the athletes safe, first and foremost.
Shannon, as you look at the challenges in a college landscape, as sports start coming back, right, you're dealing with students that are living in dorms or other campus environments or off campus. You're dealing with a fair amount of travel for college sports to different locations. Um, what is the plan look like as competition starts coming back in terms of trying to evaluate how do we truly protect the athletes while allowing sports to return?
I think that starts with education of the athletes and getting them to buy in. That while their friends might be going out to bars, restaurants, etc., that as an athlete, they may need to make some different decisions. So I think it starts there, and really, if they are motivated to make the choices that are going to mitigate the spread of COVID and keep them healthy, then we're going to be better off than if they don't, to start with. And then it's just about developing processes to minimize risk. And I mean, sometimes it gets as micromanaged as seating charts on airplanes and rooming situations on the road, to decrease risk, and to decrease spread. The advent of rapid testing, point of care testing, is also helpful, just because we're able to get more data points And then, continued PCR testing, which is still the gold standard, allows us to really have that overwhelming sense of like, okay, things are good right now, things are okay. And so there's so many different pieces that go into it to mitigate the risk of spread and infection, both within our campus community and our athletic community, and then also at the community at large.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that I've seen when you talk about the travel arrangements, right? You talk about where people are sitting on a flight, how they're rooming. You're kind of left. My daughter's in a sorority at the University of Wisconsin, and I said to her early on, you're kind of left with the lowest common denominator, right? The person who is taking the most or least caution, right? Most reckless in a sense, is the one that's kind of setting the bar for the entire team, potentially the entire, for Shannon, the entire athletic department or organization, because they're going to be going to training, strength and conditioning or athletic trainers, coaches, right? Ricky, same type of thing on your end as you're working with that. If you've got an athlete who is on a particular team that is more reckless, how do you deal with that? Let's start with Ricky, and then we'll come back to Shannon.
Yeah, so I mean, you're spot on, and this was something I think even in the example you were just laying out, it's not just within the athletic department, it's also within the conference. So like Ohio State, Gene Smith is probably telling the truth that Ohio State's doing everything they can, for their athletes, but is Maryland, for example. And if Maryland's not, the moment that Ohio State plays Maryland, you now have, opened yourself up to that riskier behavior that's maybe being done by a different university. So for us, again, it goes back to closed environment to remove that. And while, we are athlete first in pretty much everything we do, that is the one place where it's going to be maybe a little antithetical to our mission, or at least on its face seem antithetical to our mission, that we're going to have to rule with an iron fist, so to speak. Like, if you break the rules, you're out of the bubble, you're out of the league, period. So there is which again, this is where I take it back to the employee context. As with any employee, there's certain expectations that come, with having that status and with being compensated for your time, energy, and effort. And, as long as that employer is not breaking any laws, what rules and regulations they put in place, you're going to have to abide by. And one of those for us is going to be that, once you're inside of the PCL bubble, or whatever you want to call it, you stay within it until we're done. And if you leave it, then you're done. Because the only way that this thing is a complete failure is if you have an outbreak and you have to shut down. So that's going to be very clearly laid out for our athletes, that by agreeing to participate in this, there are certain expectations that you're going to have to abide by. And if you don't, then you're not going to get the opportunity to continue to play in the PCL.
So it's probably a little bit easier environment from Ricky's end to control than it is for you, Shannon, as you look at how many student athletes does Arizona State have in a given year?
We have about 650. And sometimes, it can be a challenge. And so, we've got a great group of student athlete leaders that really helps kind of set the tone. And then it's relying on some positive peer pressure as well. When you ask someone to work out in a mask that hasn't worked out in a mask before, they're like, no way, I can't do this. There's no way. And so you get some of those leaders on the team to number one, set good examples and to really encourage them. Hey, I wear a mask for you, you wear a mask for me. And so we got to do it for each other. And so it's really about building that team dynamic as well, that can help make people make the right choices. Because sometimes it's tough when you're 19 and all your friends are going to go to a restaurant and you don't know if you should. sometimes those social pressures really start to pull at you. And so it's just the reminder of like, hey, like I got to do this for my team. I got to do this because I want to play sports, because it's really, you can't bubble a college campus.
Yeah.
And it's trying to get them to self quarantine and to make those right decisions so it'd be similar as if they were living in a bubble.
Well, I think you hit it right on the head in terms of some of those pressures, because you said they don't know what to do. I mean, the answer is they know what the right decision is, right? But it's no different than drugs or alcohol, where every year, right, all of the athletes in college sports understand what the requirements are and what the regulations are and the risks in terms of doing those things, and team penalties and drug testing and everything else that goes on. In a sense, this is along those same lines. I mean, you know what is considered risky behavior. I think the harder part here is that there's certain things that you may not normally consider risky behavior, because if it's alcohol or drugs, you understand, like, that's my choice of whether that goes into my body, right? I pretty much have control over that, right, with rare exception. But the COVID thing, if somebody else is being reckless that you don't know about, you may not be aware of the need to avoid that person, whether that's a teammate, a roommate, a roommate's roommate, or boyfriend,
Or,
girlfriend,
yeah,
spouse.
or if you're even out doing community service, right? Which is something like, it's encouraged. And so it's really rethinking a lot of those types of activities, because you don't necessarily know the status of the other people that are around you. And so, my first educational point as I'm talking to people is assume everyone else has it. And so make sure that you are spaced out. I don't like the word socially distanced, because I don't think we need to distance ourselves socially from others, because social connections are important, but we need to physically distance. And so I always talk about it in those terms. So you don't need to lose your communication with your teammates, with your friends, but you need to think about different ways to do it. It may not be in person. It may not be movie night on the couch together. It might be movie night in separate chairs together, and then you're going to wear a mask, and so it's just about rethinking a lot of those elements to create space where humans can still thrive, but still be safe. And I think there is a way to do both.
And I think what's really interesting about the way that you raised that, right, you talked about socially distant, and I think in the concept of isolation for COVID, that's the worst thing for people, is socially distant. I think the term, whatever started that term, has just done a poor job, because you're really talking about physical distance, not social distance. The need from a mental health perspective to be able to stay in contact and communicate with people, even if it's not ideal. I think all of us that are here for Sports Philanthropy World would much rather that these conversations are in person, and that we would be having interaction and communication and being able to sit down with people directly and have lunch and snacks and everything else. It's just not the reality, at least for 2020. It may or may not be the reality for 2021. But we look at, how do you deal with the mental health issues, Shannon, for the athletes, because they've got really, in a sense, a double whammy. For many of them, they're losing their social life, which is similar to everybody else, but they're also losing their sport. And for many of them, that's their identity. That is what drives them on a day-to-day basis, part of in large context.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you're bringing this up, because we are really at the edge of just an epidemic. There was a study that was recently released out of France, and it looked at university students there, and they looked at about 70,000 university students. And really what they found was that 42.8% had at least one mental health outcome, including 11.4 that had some element of suicidality during the study, which is staggering. It's terrifying. The NCAA also did a great study at the beginning of the pandemic, and they looked at 37,000 total student athletes across all divisions. And really what they found out is that the majority were experiencing high rates of mental distress, including a third that were having sleep difficulties, a quarter that were experiencing sadness and a sense of loss. And 1 in 12 that were feeling so depressed that it was difficult to function. So it is an issue. And so again, expanding that conversation, normalizing these emotions, because there is a lot of loss, especially when it's like, can we have a season? Can we not? What am I supposed to do? I can't work out. What do I do with all this energy? What do I do with all this emotion? And so having resources on campus, figuring out other ways to connect with people, all of those things really are so important for the health of our student athletes.
Ricky, how do you deal with that from the PCL side? You're not, in a sense, as responsible probably as Shannon is directly for some of those issues with the athletes, but in a very real sense, you are what they look to in terms of their experience and what they're going to be involved with.
Yeah. So, I mean, as the CEO, I ultimately sign off on it. So I'm definitely involved in the process. And, we've really been trying to follow and track what's been successful and not successful, and, those that come before us, getting back to having data and understanding, exactly what works and what doesn't work, or at least to the extent possible. So for us, that's part of the sales pitch, is that the environment that we're trying to build really is going to be a community, and that these athletes, as we'll see how it continues to play out, especially, I'm just talking about college basketball for the most part. We don't know that there's going to be a college basketball season. I know that yesterday's news has kind of shaken these MTE tournaments, with various cancellations and whatnot, or postponements. So, having something next summer that potentially could be all that's offered to at least a portion of college basketball players between now and whenever we get to the other side of the pandemic, is something that we take seriously, and something that we're trying to create the best environment possible that's both safe, but also, like I said, community driven. I think back to, I think it was FC Bayern put out a video their players did, talking about some of the physical distancing stuff that Shannon was talking about, where, I mean, it was meant to be a little comedic and funny, but it was also meant to be like, here's how athletes that are living together within a facility need to behave. And like, they had like these 6-foot sticks and stuff that they would hold out and make sure that, like, if you're sitting and watching TV together, you can hold this stick up, and that, you won't be touching the person next to you, and, always wear your masks. And if you're somewhere that it allows, have windows open and things like that, so that you've got a flow of air going through. So, I mean, it's that sort of stuff that we continue to look at and figure. I mean, we have the benefit of time, to the extent that that's possible. That we've got, however many months, 7 more months, I think, before our first, before we would have our first game. So, we've got the benefit of time and continuing to figure out best practices and then following those.
Yeah, I think what is really going to be hard is looking at where we're going to be, recognizing we're only not even 8 months in this, right? 7 to 8 months at this point, right? Everything shut down basically March 11th was when it started shutting down. And so, just, a week after the election, we'll hit the 8-month mark. And you think of another 8 months from there, that only gets us into June. And you look at everything that's changed over these first 8 months of what we've learned and what's gone on, and all of the predictions for the dire forecasts of the number of deaths and the escalation of the spread. Shannon, as you do that, both from a risk assessment perspective, but really from a long-term planning, how do you even start coming up with a plan, knowing that, until you get to, let's say, the end of March, you don't really know what to start thinking about for next summer or fall?
Yeah, so it is tough because the forecasting becomes very challenging. So I think that first and foremost, it's about being nimble and about being quick on your feet to adjust to changes that happen, whether it's, increased numbers, increased positivity rates, or, regulations that are changing through the CDC and the county health department. It's about, hey, like, yep, we need to make this change and we need to make it now. Which sometimes can be tough. Change can be tough. So it's kind of getting used to that uncertainty of this is how it is now, tomorrow may be different. And just being able to prepare for that, and then having a plan B and a plan C and a plan D, and trying to, right now looking forward to, the NCAA basketball season. Okay, like what are our plans? And if this doesn't go right, then can we go into plan B? If that doesn't go right, how about plan C? And just figuring out, all the different permutations that can potentially happen, which sometimes can be a challenge because you certainly can't plan for everything, but it's about being flexible enough and being comfortable to make those changes rapidly.
Ricky, what about from your side, when you look at what kind of planning you need to have to move forward, right? We're sitting here at the end of October of 2020. When do you think is sort of a go, no go decision on things that you need to make?
I mean, to Shannon's point, we're getting probably way further into the alphabet than either of us would like in terms of the number of plans. To go through and exhaust all of them.
Not as many as the hurricanes, though. You're not gone through the alphabet and on the Greek letters yet.
No, we haven't gotten to the Greek letters yet, though. I bet Andy and his love of those languages may relish that opportunity. But no, I mean, so for us, I mean, pretty much up until a point where we 100% know we cannot successfully pull it off in a safe way, which, I mean, theoretically, you could, May probably is when we'd have to make that final, just at the point at which people would start reporting for our like preseason training camp. If at that point it's not safe, then that would be when we would postpone things.
Well, it's a challenging issue. I know that we've all been living with it very intently over the last 7 to 8 months. I think we're going to continue to have this for a while, and I don't think anybody knows what that while means. So before I let you guys go, I want to put you on the spot a little bit. I've heard part of Shannon's answer before, so I'm going to let her go second, so that she doesn't bias Ricky, and give him all of the deep insight. Ricky, we're going to put you on the spot right now. You're looking out at the sports landscape. Tell me when the first professional sports league is going to have open stadium, full set of fans.
Technically, it's already happened. New Zealand already did it.
The U.S., how about that? U.S.
The U.S. full slate of fans.
No restrictions. Just normal day at the office.
I can't imagine anything before 2022, and I feel like that's probably optimistic. I'm very interested to hear Shannon being the medical expert's opinion, but just me guessing off of what information I've familiarized myself with and the trends in terms of cases, deaths, utilization of the hospital systems and all that, and safely pulling off an event operationally. I mean, outdoor stadiums, I feel like theoretically maybe by 2022, and indoor stadiums, it may take longer, or it should take longer than that. But that would be, I guess, 22 is my guess.
All right, Shannon?
So I'm still the cautiously optimistic one, and I think fall 2021. I think there's going to be some attempt to have some limited numbers, over the next couple of months, and so we'll see how that goes, and we'll see really what happens with this flu season and with kind of additional surges with coronavirus. But I'd love to see it in fall of 2021.
Yeah, it's interesting because over the last few months, I've been asking people that, going back to March and April when this first started. And it's been interesting to watch the progression of that timeline, because originally it was summer, and then it was like, oh, for sure, fall. And then, well, okay, January 1 type of time frame. And I think people are now accepting some of those initial estimates that they didn't want to accept, that you would hear from Dr. Fauci or others when they said it was going to take 18 months from when everything first started. People didn't want to listen or believe that, right? They just weren't ready to accept that. I don't think any of us on March 1st, if you would have told us that sports are shutting down and literally in 2 days all the sports are going to shut down. I was at the NFL Combine on March 1st, right? And everybody's running around Indianapolis and the hotels and the lobbies and meetings and everything going on. And 10 days later at a networking event, we're watching on TV as they are announcing, well, yeah, the tournament's going to go on. We're just not going to have fans tomorrow. And then by the time the morning broke, it was like everything was done. So it's going to be interesting to follow. As Shannon knows, my vote would be much more aligned with Ricky's. From what I'm hearing, indoor facilities are basically being told not to expect full-scale fans until no earlier than January of 2022. And I want to cast my vote, though, for Shannon, because I'd much rather that her answer is correct and that by next fall we can get back to everything is normal. I think we will see an improvement in terms of some of the assessment of how to have limited fans and limited composition of fan base. I think there will be improvements on that. So I think somewhere along the lines, but to expect 80,000 people in a stadium, I'm not sure I see that for next fall.
We can keep our fingers crossed that Shannon's right, and then we're just being overly pessimistic.
Well, Shannon's got my vote for sure. That's 100% true. So thank you both for your time. We really appreciate your participation in sports philanthropy world. You shared some great insight, and I know a lot of people we spoke to are going to come back and watch these for some guidance on how they can assess those risks and determine what the next steps should be. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.